I just started the recording, so.
I have to teach at 1 o'clock, so I'll step out then.
Okay. Thanks everybody for being here, and welcome to our talk. Sorry, I'm like slightly distracted by my cat who insists on being here too. But so yeah, welcome to today's event, which is co-sponsored by the East Asian Library, the Korean Office for Research and Education at York University, which is funded by the Academy of Korean Studies, and the Department of East Asian Studies at U of T. I'd especially like to thank Hannah Kim, Director of the East Asian Library here, and Min Young Ke and Hyunok Park of York University, and the Kore Project, and my home department at U of T, Natasha Vanderberg for logistical help, and Shun Pan for creating the poster for today's event, which is beautiful and amazing. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I wanted to say a few words about the importance of this act of acknowledging the past and present histories of the material conditions that make our work possible. My hope for this talk series is to enable those of us who identify as Asian studies scholars to think critically and relationally about race in our scholarship, to offer critiques of race that are specific to the regional and geopolitical contexts on which we focus, that is to say, importantly distinct from Euro-American histories of racialization and structures of racialized antagonism, but that nonetheless acknowledge that race thinking has been significant in shaping East Asia. And so today we're honored to have Professor Jeremy Tai with us to share his work on racial capitalism in the Chinese context. Jeremy Tai is Assistant Professor of Modern Chinese History at McGill University, and he received his PhD in history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's currently completing a book manuscript that examines how the history of Xi'an has been shaped over the past century by state programs of redistribution that channeled investment, industry, and population from coastal to inland China in moments of territorial and capitalist crisis. His second project considers socialist critiques of racial capitalism and their legacies in contemporary China. So his talk today is entitled Racial Capitalism and the National Question in Early People's Republic of China. And without further ado, I'll hand things over to Professor Tai. Or wait, just before that, I just want to say the format of this event is pretty standard for talk events, but it's also maybe a little less formal in the sense that we have the opportunity to engage in a conversation afterwards, unlike the format of the webinar where participants are not really able to be present in the same ways. So using that kind of affordance of this type of meeting, I hope that we can have a lively conversation after the talk. So stick around if you can for that. But without further ado now, I will hand things over to Professor Tai.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Michelle. Thanks also to you and Hannah for organizing this talk. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share some work in progress with you all. Also the opportunity to connect with colleagues in Toronto. It's really nice to meet you all, including those of you at the library. I actually received an East Asian Library resource access grant last year, and that allowed me to conduct some primary source research, and that was crucial at a time when research trips to China have not been possible. Before I proceed any further, I also want to do a land acknowledgement. So I'm presenting from Montreal, or Jojage, unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka and Anishinaabe nations. I also want to wish those of you who are celebrating this week a happy Year of the Tiger. So let me share my screen. Is this working? Yes. Okay, great. The focus of my talk today is the conceptualization of race and nation in the early People's Republic of China, particularly the ways in which its intellectuals attempted to clarify and distinguish these two terms. So China scholars have long discussed the modern translation of these terms, especially how Chinese nationalism was articulated through them in the late Cheng and Republican eras. So in spite of widespread discussion, there were many different interpretations of race and nation, and the terms were often used interchangeably in the early 20th century. So from some of the from scholars like Rebecca Carl, we know that some of the earliest formulations of race signaled a type of sameness, so same kind. And that was understood through historical configurations of power, and it made possible identifications with countries undergoing colonization and a loss of sovereignty around the world. At the same time, there were intellectuals that also maintain racialist thinking, so maintaining the logics, hierarchies, and exclusions of scientific racism. And so some, they attempted to cross the global color line. They claimed the superiority of the yellow race, and they also pointed to possibilities for Pan-Asianism. And others, they argued for proximity to whiteness and the need for miscegenation. So there are a lot of ambiguities, and these were ambiguities that were shared with other contexts around the world. And so definitions continue to be debated well into the 1940s with different epistemologies and also archives in mind. So in the 1940s, when you look at some of the discussions of race and nation at that time, you have writers remarking about the lack of clarity with these terms. And so they ask questions like, are the five constitutive groups of the republic minzu, nation, or race, zhongzu? They also asked, can a nation state, a guojia, consist of multiple races or nations, so multiple zhongzu or minzu? They also asked who is part of the Chinese nation, Zhonghua Minzu. So I'm interested in how these terms eventually were distinguished and they came to signify for a popular audience domestic and foreign modes of social differentiation. So one of my points of departure for tracing this trajectory of race and nation in Chinese discourse is this ongoing critique of area studies for a lack of engagement with questions of race. So scholars have long noted this deep-seated disciplinary divide between area studies and ethnic studies, how area studies is home to various studies of geopolitics, while ethnic studies is home to the study of race. So critics have pointed to the ways in which this divide reflects certain foundational orientations, namely how area studies was founded to support American strategic interests during the Cold War, and how ethnic studies was formed after student demands for greater inclusion and representation. Critics have pointed to both problems of methodology and also positionality. So for instance, you have criticisms of David Theo Goldberg pointing to how comparative methods that are typical of area studies can be quite problematic for the study of race. So he discusses how the juxtaposition of discrete national examples can miss how race and racism are both globally circulating and also locally indexed. Likewise, Shi Shumei has pointed out how this civilizational culturalist scholarship in Asian studies can work to recast racialization as cultural difference and also disavow the global connections that constitute racial formation. So area specialists have been also criticized for being quite dismissive of colleagues that are working in the vein of ethnic studies. And this is an unease that's symptomatic of the premise of separation from one's object of study in area studies. So of course we have studies of Afro-Asian solidarity, Asian diaspora, and other trans-Pacific connections over the past 2 decades that have really done important work in bridging these fields. But scholars continue to note how critical approaches to race remain limited in Asian studies, especially when compared to the popularity of critical theory and post-colonial studies. So I build on these discussions, focusing on divisions within the US Academy by turning to the ways in which certain conventions in China can also foreclose considerations of race in the field. And so we know that the China field is at the same time home to a significant body of literature on nationalism and ethnicity. So I'm thinking with Lisa Lowe's Intimacies of Four Continents here. And so in that book, she considers the archive of liberalism. She discusses how liberal narratives of freedom were articulated within this context that was marked by settler colonialism, slavery, indentured labor, and empire. And she talks about how these liberal narratives of freedom serve to disavow the constitutive violence of these processes. So for Lowe, reading across areas in the archive of liberalism can reveal imbricated processes and the unspoken intimacies of colonized and dispossessed peoples. So I'm interested in thinking alongside Lowe about the archive of actually existing socialism. And so Chinese socialism, of course, articulated its own understandings of liberation, and its archive reveals categorical distinctions as well, categorical distinctions that can be productively brought together to illustrate the relations, tensions, and contradictions between different political projects. So my discussion below considers how the archive of actually existing socialism separated race and nation within a discursive field that was shaped not only by historical materialism, but also Cold War politics and state territorialization. So from a survey of primary sources in the early PRC, it seems that key here was the geopolitical necessity to separate the critique of racial capitalism and discussions of the national question under socialism. The effect of this is externalizing processes of racialization. And once reified, this distinction can also externalize the geography of racial capitalism long afterwards, even in an era of neoliberal multiculturalism. So I'm interested in this concept of racial capitalism, of course, and how it can be a useful concept in our current historical moment, and also its possibilities for bridging area and ethnic studies. So the term racial capitalism originates with South African Marxists in their analyses of apartheid. And then it was articulated by Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism, and is often associated with that work. So Robinson argued against conventional Marxist understandings of capitalism as this force of historical progress that negated feudalism. And introduces the proletariat as the universal subject of history. So his work builds on what he calls the Black radical tradition, represented in the work of W.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright. So they had shown in their studies of slavery how unfree labor was not left behind with the march of time, but it was constitutive of capitalist development. So Robinson argues that capitalism maintains earlier modes of violence and subjugation in Europe that were based on regional, cultural, and linguistic differences. And so he specifically points to the invasion, bondage, and colonization that were experienced by the Irish, Jews, Romans, Slavs. And he argues that capitalism further articulates them to include the taxonomies of scientific racism. So for Robinson, capitalism works through social differentiation rather than the homogenization of the world into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So his work has inspired this growing body of scholarship on racialized exploitation and expropriation. And of course, you have older literature on racialized exploitation with scholars like Lisa Lowe and David Rediger, and how they had argued early on that the analytical category of abstract labor can obscure racial divisions that are central to the production of surplus value. There's also ways in which scholars have revealed the limits of analyses centered on the exploitation of the free wage worker. And so you have studies of indigenous, racialized, and gendered forms of expropriation that illustrate the often violent and coercive conditions that are necessary for the establishment of private property regimes, debt and extractive economies, and social reproduction. So Robinson's concept of racial capitalism has been conspicuously absent in the China field, but existing scholarship would suggest that it's far from foreign to Chinese society and culture. So since, oh, sorry, wrong slide. um, since the 19th century, political authorities and intellectuals in China have been highly conscious of the global color line coined by W.B. Du Bois and the ways that it structured the nation's standing in the modern capitalist world as one of the so-called colored races. So early on, imperialist wars against China sought to demonstrate its racial inferiority and its need to cast off supposedly barbaric practices for its own universal principles, including free trade. 19th century liberal thinkers heralded the introduction of Chinese coolies to North American colonies as a transition from unfree to free labor in an era of abolition. But despite the presence of contracts, conditions likened to slavery led some to argue that indentured workers were far from harbingers of freedom. Anti-Chinese activists seized on these discussions of the coolie to argue for exclusion as a means to keep Chinese slavery out, even in the case of voluntary migrants. So Chinese exclusion in Anglo-American societies allowed white settlers and immigrants to appropriate native identity and assimilate indigenous and racialized communities. And all the while, this spurred protests in China and compelled diasporic populations to return to an imagined homeland. You also have, of course, numerous references to red, brown, Jewish nations in this period, and the figure of the Black slave was particularly popular as a metaphor for considering various forms of subjugation and possibilities for redemption. And so in my earlier work, I noticed how the critique of racial capitalism occurred across the political spectrum, including among the Chinese right. So in the 1930s, I was looking at how the Kuomintang responded to the Great Depression by searching for a colonial lifeline, in this case, Northwest China. And so the Kuomintang drew on Sun Yat-sen's plans for frontier development that were inspired by the American frontier story and proposed the building of transcontinental railroads, the settling of so-called virgin land, and the exploitation of resources. They went further to romanticize the Northwest as this place in which the nation would rid itself of bourgeois decadence and radical politics that they found abhorrent in colonial treaty ports. So as part of this call to open up the Northwest, the Kuomintang attempted to hail overseas Chinese, and they believed that overseas Chinese could apply their experiences as so-called pioneers to frontier expansion within China. So central authorities and overseas organizations, they solicited investment from overseas Chinese communities, and they also organized tours for Chinese from Cuba, Siam, Annam, England, India, etc. And they presented the region as the so-called Great Gold Mountain of the future. And of course, this is compared to San Francisco, the Old Gold Mountain, and also Melbourne, the New Gold Mountain, terms that were coined during the gold rush in the 1850s. So these discussions, they posited the return of overseas Chinese, not simply for the sake of actualizing capitalist deterritorialization and reterritorialization of this crisis, but also in response to widespread accounts of racist violence, coercion, and exclusion that they acknowledged as integral to the making of the modern capitalist world. So for instance, you have Chen Shuren, head of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Committee in Nanjing, describing how migrants had gone overseas because of the crises brought on by imperialism. And here he's referring, of course, to the Opium War that quickly gave way to the Taiping Civil War. And in Southeast Asia and Australia, Chen discusses how they served as so-called beasts of burden in colonization projects and built the fortunes of imperialist powers on their blood and sweat. And so for Chen, exclusion policies amounted to getting rid of someone once they had served their purpose. In her travel diary of the Northwest in 1932 to 1933, overseas Chinese pilot Lin Pengxia discussed how Chinese labor had built the transcontinental railroads in the US and Canada and colonies in Southeast Asia. Yet in spite of shedding blood and sweat, their painstaking efforts seemed to be all for nothing. Their labor resulted in neither the expansion of Chinese sovereignty over these territories, nor their recognition as citizens of other nations. So excluded from property regimes and formal equality, overseas Chinese were, again, dehumanized as beasts of burden, subject to being glared at, mistreated, and deported. She talks about how racial exclusion and national competition only increased with the downturn in the world economy. So instead of being at the beck and call of other nations, Ling calls on overseas Chinese to return to their homeland, where they could be pioneers in China's own neglected region. So Chen, Lin, and others writing at that time were highly sensitive to the ways in which the disposability of Chinese labor and life came to light during nationalist and nativist movements, most recently set within financial crises. So across the Americas and Southeast Asia, anti-Chinese violence and exclusion occurred through the identification of Chinese with the seemingly abstract and destructive dimensions of capitalism, such as mechanical efficiency, less than human labor that seem to be exempt from the needs of normative social reproduction. So from the personification of capitalist excess, supporters of Northwest development envisioned a means for overseas Chinese to personify nationalism instead. It seemed that racism expressed as part of capitalist world becoming could only be overcome by restoring national wholeness and self-reliance. So these writers envisioned Chinese withdrawal from the colonies as contributing to the expansion of capitalism within the nation form, a capitalism without racial capitalism. Capitalism without racial capitalism in this instance spoke to the experiences of overseas Chinese, but it fell short of addressing non-Han peoples in these areas and questions of dispossession that were underlying capitalism. And these plans were eventually interrupted by the outbreak of war with Japan. So now let me turn to the leftists. So the CCP applied the concepts of race and nation to different political fronts. And both of these became articulated in relation to the perils of fascism, especially after the Second World War. So the CCP lambasted the Kuomintang for its lack of recognition of Han peoples, non-Han peoples, seeking to present itself as scholar Oradin Bulag has formulated themselves as the good Han versus the bad Han. And so leftist intellectuals, they rejected the Kuomintang as fascist Han chauvinists, a counterpart to the great Russian chauvinism. So in the 1920s and 1930s, you have Marxist philosophers Li Da and Chicho Bai introducing the national question using Soviet sources. And early on, Chicho Bai criticized the Kuomintang for defining the nation as this primordial community based in blood relations. So debates about the nature and limits of the body politic, also the nation's geobody, had led the Kuomintang to claim common ancestry between Han and non-Han peoples. And this was famously articulated in Chiang Kai-shek's China's Destiny that was written during the Second World War. And so he claims that the Han were the main stock and the non-Han were branches of the same race and blood, and they were only differentiated by religion and region. So after World War II, Marxist historian Liu Zhenyu argued that such arguments about racial stocks only followed the wishful thinking of German and Japanese fascists. In contrast to Kuomintang assimilationist policies and lack of recognition, he also reminded readers how Han and non-Han peoples have been mutually constituted over time. We also know that when organizing in the hinterland, the Chinese Communist Party tried to win the support of non-Han peoples by recognizing a multi-ethnic polity, espousing the right to self-determination, incorporating ethnic oppression into social analysis, and also banning ethnic slurs and insults. As for race, communist internationalism, class-based organizing had long rejected liberal and fascist discourses of race as a form of false consciousness. But after World War II, the Holocaust led Chinese socialist intellectuals to further reject problematic theories that seem commensurable with fascism. And so biologist Zhou Jianren, this is the brother of famous writers Lu Xun and Zhou Zuoren. He had been one of the early translators of eugenics in China, and he did so when he was editor of the commercial press in the 1920s. But after World War II, he began to warn the reading public that capitalist countries deployed eugenics as a tool to support these false and unscientific claims of an inborn lack of intelligence and morality amongst the lower classes. And so as a biologist, Joe clarifies that Darwin's Origin of the Species was intended to refute theories of divine creation by arguing that all living things were products of history. And this common grounding in history was lost in the singularities and forms of exceptionalism that were found in eugenics and racialist theories like Aryanism. And so drawing on Engels' critique of Malthus, he argues that the size and qualities of population were much more complex and contingent than abstractions that only served as justification for racism, war, and colonialism. And he points specifically to the works of Huxley, Hobbes, von Bernardi, and Nietzsche. So for Joe, the Holocaust stood out as the greatest consequence of racialist theorization. And even though fascism had been defeated in World War II, he argued that it's important to remain vigilant as its remnants could spread. He pointed specifically to cases of violence that were being committed by American GIs stationed in China after the war. And he argued that these acts were merely extensions of racist mentalities and behavior in the US, particularly political exclusion, lynching, and sexual violence that was experienced by African Americans. In this work, he actually introduces the term strange fruit to Chinese readers and even includes the only image within this book, an image of lynching. So in the early People's Republic of China, some social scientists responded to the remnants of fascist ideology by trying to clarify the definition of race. So they often reproduced an orthodox Marxist designation of race as a pre-capitalist social formation, or they situated race outside of history altogether. They often reiterated the need to return to Stalin's discussion of the national question. For instance, so this is Stalin. So for instance, historian Huang Yuqi of Henan University, also editor of one of the earliest historical journals in the PRC, 新史学通讯, he pointed out how Chinese historians still didn't have this clear conceptualization of nation and race. He attributed the conflation of nation and race to the Kuomintang and its right-wing emphasis on blood relations. He also pointed to the lack of standardization in Soviet translations. And so the ways in which terms like race, clan, nation, modern nation all seem to be used in a confusing manner. He explains how Chinese society comprised of different races until the Warring States period. So this early period, after which racial amalgamation occurred, and then clans emerged as the primary form of social organization in China. The Qing conquest, the feudal system, imperialism, it all arrested nation formation for Han and non-Han peoples. And then he argues that once the CCP liberated them from imperialist, bureaucratic capitalists, Han landlords, and non-Han elites, they had become this new democratic minzu nation under CCP leadership. You also have sociologist Rong Guanxiong writing in the same journal years later in the late 1950s, still criticizing intellectuals in the early PRC for misusing race in their understanding of historical social formation. For him, he explained how you had these communities that were historical communities that were distinct from race. So he explains how clans and tribes were the communities of primitive communism, how tribal federations were the basis of slave and feudal society, and how nations were particular to capitalism and communism. So for Rome, what was especially troubling in this period were references to non-Han peoples as separate races. And so he is particularly upset by a barrage of new terms that emerged in the 1950s, such as racial wars, racial contradictions, racial oppression, and racial struggles. According to Rome, race was an effect of environmental factors on outward appearance. It had no bearing on economic production, social development, or cultural formation. It was a biological phenomenon that was subject to anthropological research, not a social one like nation, subject to ethnological research. So for these social scientists, race could not be a determining factor for historical analysis or a category for modern political organizing. At times, they problematically reinforce the categories of racial science through references to phenotype, and at others, they destabilize biological associations by claiming that there was no pure race. So earlier worlding practices combined with this global moment of decolonization and this new socialist state, it served as the grounds for internationalist solidarity with anti-colonial and anti-racial struggles. And this all moves discussions of race beyond these orthodox positions. So the official journal World Affairs 世界知识 becomes this important forum for critiques of racial capitalism at that time. So lots of coverage of apartheid in South Africa and also Jim Crow in the US. And these were presented to Chinese audiences as continuous with wartime fascism. So for instance, you have editor Chen Zanwei reporting how in South Africa, indigenous Africans, Indians, Malays, and Chinese were subject to legislation that affected forced removal, separate settlements, political disenfranchisement, low wage and dangerous work in mines, unhealthy environments, and also counterinsurgency campaigns. So by contrast, white South Africans held over 88% of land, and US investment in copper, magnesium, and uranium mines, motor vehicle, rubber production, and shipbuilding grew during and after the war. And so as PRC leaders like Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong issued statements of solidarity, the journal publicized the work of anti-apartheid activists that were organizing the general strike in 1950 and the historic defiance campaign of 1952. So writing after the UN denunciation of racist policies in South Africa, a scholar of international law, Cheng reminded readers in the lead up to the Bandung conference that racism and colonialism were the common experience of African and Asian people. He discusses how racism facilitated the oppression of national minorities, colonized and semi-colonized nations, how racism facilitated labor exploitation, as well as false consciousness that displays class-based politics. The clearest example of racism for him was found in Aryanism and the genocide of 6 million Jews. And he calls this the most shameful page in human history. In the post-war period, the racial divisions produced in apartheid South Africa were only mirrored for him in European landholdings in Tunisia, the Gold Coast, and the Belgian Congo, as well as the hyper-exploitation of indigenous labor in Nigeria, Kenya, and French North Africa. For Chen, the center of racism, though, was not Africa, but the US. And it's in the US where the ruling classes manipulated the rule of law to perpetuate white supremacy and indoctrinate contempt for the so-called colored races whose labor reaped great profits for American capitalists. So following the end of slavery, the police, courts, white supremacists all colluded with one another to commit gross injustices against Black people, including political disenfranchisement, segregation, voting intimidation, and lynching. For him, the conceits of so-called American democracy were only further challenged by racist violence and exclusion against Chinese and other Asian communities. And he points to how these were later reproduced in Australia and New Zealand as well. The state of emergency in British Malaya also witnessed the deportation of Chinese and the establishment of fortified new villages for Chinese supporters of insurgents. So from all of these examples that were meant to foster Afro-Asian solidarity, Chen Tiqiang concludes that racism could not be considered a domestic issue. And he points particularly to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and its definition of crimes against humanity. So the People's Republic of China was very much in conversation with the context of South Africa, also the Black radical tradition that inspired the concept of racial capitalism. For Black radicals like W.B. Du Bois, China also challenged a white and Western vision of class struggle, and its revolution represented an extension of their anti-capitalist and anti-racist politics on the world stage. So besides critical coverage of US policies, also racist violence, the editors of World Affairs demonstrated solidarity by publishing firsthand accounts in translation. So for instance, they reproduced an op-ed that was written by a 19-year-old Black resident of Buffalo, in which the author tried to dispel any illusions about northern states in the US with a description of the dire poverty in her city and also the need for socialism. You also have an essay by James Jackson, Southern director of the Communist Party, that discussed the Black freedom struggle for economic opportunities, political rights, and social welfare. Also its intersections with worker, anti-imperialist, and communist organizing. An interview conducted with Robert and Mabel Williams in Beijing described their work with the NAACP, Armed Defense Against White Supremacists, and eventually their exile to Cuba. So the official visits by W.B. and Shirley Graham Du Bois, William Worthy, Vicki Garvin, Robert and Mabel Williams, these all produced sympathetic accounts of the PRC for American audiences, while also contributing to increased representations of Black agency in Chinese state media. So Chinese intellectuals noted how they particularly took inspiration from the representations of these official visits. Also, student sit-ins in 1960, the Freedom Rides, desegregation in Little Rock, and the University of Mississippi, the March on Washington, and the ongoing armed struggle in South Africa. And so drawing on these events, they began to attend to race as a social question. And so some revisited Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation and capital, and then extended its insights on expropriation to an era of US imperialism and monopoly capitalism. So you have sociologists Zhang Chunhan and Shi Zhemin challenging orthodox periodization, considering how the capitalist class inherited existing forms of racism, introduced new notions of physiological and mental differences, and then popularized them on a global scale for the purposes of exploitation and colonization. They argued that US policies obscure the material effects of racism by not recognizing how the race question was animated by class struggle. And they specifically pointed to the arguments of Robert Williams. And so one of the examples that they use is the hyper exploitation of the Black worker through wage gaps. And they attribute accumulation of US monopoly capitalism to that. And so as Black activists and organizations took the media to be a site of anti-racist struggle and also held race relations in the US up to global scrutiny during the Cold War, American policymakers began to turn to multiculturalism and then also challenge white supremacist beliefs. And they did so in the face of Southern elites that argued against racial integration precisely because of socialist support. So at this time of geopolitical competition, the PRC pitted racial capitalism against its own vision of socialist ethnopolitics. And this had the effect that racism could only exist elsewhere. So according to Cheng and others that I've mentioned, the Soviet Union and China had eliminated racial oppression domestically, and it became this big, loving, and united family of different nationalities. So like the Soviet Union, the CCP departed from its earlier position regarding self-determination, particularly following Japanese overtures to non-Han peoples, the establishment of puppet states during the Second World War, and you have nationality eventually becoming this category of territorial governance. And so the Constitution promulgated the right to autonomy and self-government for non-Han peoples, while also asserting that these autonomous regions were inalienable parts of China. You also have ethnologists serving newly consolidated territory and designating official classifications for political representation. And the CCP pursued a united front with local elites while training minority cadres drawn from the lower classes. So while race cannot be considered a domestic issue, nationality became one in China. So publications on the national question in the 1950s emphasized how the historical relationships between different tribes, tribal federations, and nations, including their contradictions and wars, were all domestic in nature. And so the CCP also maintained the separation of race and ethnicity by carefully orchestrating itineraries for foreign visitors that kept politically sensitive subjects out of sight, including the Tibetan uprising. So in spite of the political lines drawn between racial capitalism and socialist ethnopolitics, China's scholars have documented problematic representations, assimilationist policies, and political violence that targeted ethnic and religious minorities as backward and feudal. Of course, political questions also became understood in economic terms as an effect of uneven development. Political elites in the PRC did not completely abandon notions of blood lineage either, and so eventually drawing on them to articulate the idea that revolutionary credentials could be determined by personal background rather than political consciousness. At the same time, Maoist solidarity was also betrayed by nationalism, such as the border war with India, and also developmentalist hierarchies, especially in its relations with African countries. Not unlike the ways in which class-based politics subsumed the political subjects of women and also nation, particularly during the Cultural Revolution, state media also followed Mao's declaration that the racial question is in essence a class question, and the universal frame of world proletarian revolution flattened differences. And it also excluded questions of hindered considerations of expropriation beyond exploitation. And so just to conclude, so in this talk, I'm seeking to read across areas in the archive of Chinese socialism and attend to the relational construction of race and nation in the early People's Republic of China. So I'm interested in their historical conceptualization in relation to one another, global events and transnational connections that shape their definitions, their mobilization for different emancipatory projects, namely solidarity against racial capitalism and Han chauvinism, and contradictions that blur political boundaries. While emptied of their former political content, the disarticulated concepts of race and ethnicity continue to reinforce geographical and conceptual divisions inherited from Cold War knowledge production. As scholars and observers have debated whether we're witnessing a new Cold War, one commonality between the past and present is the spotlight on racial and ethnic conflict. And so you have nationalists in the US and China pointing to various forms of injustice in the other. So while some scholars and observers have looked to the imperial past for understanding present-day geopolitics, certain trans-historical gestures to a Chinese world order or empire can miss capitalism's history of exploiting various axes of difference, including race, to produce surplus value. It also obscures the anti-racist and socialist world-making projects of its critics. So this talk suggests instead that it might be more useful to consider China's evolving relationship to racial capitalism, including the legacies and limitations, clear limitations of earlier critiques. And so I'll just end there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that talk. Wow. There was just, yeah, so much there, and yeah, fantastic. I think we have a good amount of time for some Q&A. So I will moderate here. So if you have a question, you can feel free to you can use these like Zoom tools, these emoticons to like raise your hand, or yeah, in some other way, gesture to your desire to speak. Yeah, so maybe while people are thinking and coming up with questions, I can start us off a little bit. So yeah, the way that you kind of sketched out the relationship between you know, various groups who are reacting to each other in terms of the way that race is being the way that they're interpreting race as a social force and as a mode of differentiation with political consequences is really helpful. But I was wondering if you could kind of say more about the point at which, or in what way, the kind of identification of race as a non-domestic problem by the socialist intellectuals that you're talking about, how that was secured. In other words, you know, it seems like because there's a lot of interest in looking at forms of racial exclusion or the impacts of racialization, say in the US context or in South Africa, that is what enables the jettisoning, I guess, of race as a category internal to the PRC, and allows the primary, I guess, category of differentiation to be nationality, right? But I guess, can you say more about how you see that happening, or yeah, where that's, I guess, argued for?
Right. Thanks for the question. I really appreciate it. So this is something I'm still working on. Of course, this is like, you know, work in progress for the second project. And here, I guess, like just from the survey of journals within the early People's Republic of China, I'm just noticing this division within intellectual discourse, just the ways in which the discussion of race operates within certain journals, whereas the discussion of ethnicity operates in other journals. And of course, these are all these are also distinguished because of these different political projects that are on the ground. And so I just want to, I guess, like, emphasize that, you know, these are really just informed by the politics in the 1950s at that time. And so there's ways in which I think this knowledge of what's going on in the Jim Crow US, also apartheid South Africa, how that lends itself to this externalization of race, or the association of race with these capitalist countries. And at the same time, I guess there's also ways in which race can be taken as this mode of signification or mode of abstraction, like within these capitalist countries, that merges different forms of social, the production of the intersection of the assignment of social value with like the production of surplus value. And so there's definitely that train of thought that I'm like following. And then there's another train of thought that like sticks to a more orthodox position that really relegates race to this far, like this this early stage of Chinese history in which you know, you have intellectuals like the ones that I mentioned, talking about how China was constituted of many different races in its early history, and then how this kind of amalgamation that occurs within this early history then renders race not a category for historical analysis afterwards. And so I think there's like two different trains of thought that I'm like trying to basically map in this period. But then at the same time, there's a way in which both of them then deny the relevance of race in some ways to the Chinese context.
That's super
I'm not sure if
helpful.
that was clear.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you. We have a question from Tak Fujitani.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your great talk. And you really covered a lot of ground. So there's, much I think that we could talk about. But one which seemed to be a kind of absence in the discourse. I don't know whether you didn't want to go over it or whether there's an absence in the discourse. And that's the legacy of the Japanese period, and whether there was in fact any kind of critique of the discourse of Asia itself as a kind of mechanism of inclusion with racism, and also whether there's any discussion of how the PRC imagination of the different 50 or so ethnic minorities or nationalities, how that in fact replicates the Manchukuo idea of the harmony of five races, as a kind of way in which the discourse of disavowal of racism itself is actually a mechanism for perpetuating this kind of racism between different groups, but just calling it something else. So I'm just wondering about that kind of strand in our thinking, because the other ones that you talk about are also important and interesting, and in particular, I think the way in which the casting of racism as somebody else's problem is very common throughout the world in non-Western countries. I mean, this was part of what the Japanese project was itself, like getting the white imperialists out of Asia, that kind of idea, and saying that the racists were on the other side, and we were the ones who actually didn't practice racism. So I guess a kind of combination of questions there.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate those questions. I guess one of the interesting things that occurs with the Second World War is the ways in which there's this critique of this Pan-Asian ideology, as you were mentioning, because of these puppet states that were set up, like in Inner Mongolia, and then also in Manchuria. And so there's ways in which this affects both the positions of the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists at that time. So the Kuomintang starts to engage much more with the question of non-Han peoples, and then starts to move away from this absence of recognition, or that it got criticized by not only the Chinese communists for, but also Japanese imperialists for as well. And so with the Chinese Communist Party, that is one of the impetuses for moving away from these promises of self-determination earlier to a policy of autonomy for these regions instead. And so I am interested in the ways in which, I guess, how we can think about ethnicity and race and the kinds of occlusions that are created through this distinction, particularly the ways in which, like, a lot of the contradictions that you see in the 1950s and 1960s in terms of the pitting of, like, racism in capitalist countries against, like, this ethnic harmony within socialist countries. And I guess, like, one of the people I'm thinking with when considering these contradictions is really Ruthie Gilmore. And so thinking about her definition of racism as the state sanction or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. And so, like, just the ways in which that definition can help bridge this divide that is produced within intellectual discourse at that time. And so I guess that's I guess how I'm thinking about this earlier period during the World War II, and then also thinking about these ways in which racism becomes externalized and how we can think a bit more critically about it. At the same time, I guess one of the things is I'm thinking like about the particularity of this discourse of ethnicity or the national question in China as well, and the ways in which it's wedded to territory. And so if we just look at like contemporary Chinese discourse, there's a way in which Chinese leaders, policy advisors have warned that this older discourse inherited from the Soviet Union can lead to separatism because of its emphasis on territory. And so they've suggested maybe depoliticizing this term and replacing minzu with a different term like zuquan, like just grouping instead. And then there have been policy advisors as well that have argued that China needs to move away from the national question and then move to an American model of multiculturalism instead, one that is not doesn't wed ethnicity to territory. And so there's certain interesting developments that you see like more recently that just can also make us think about like what I guess about the usefulness of like maintaining ethnicity as a category instead of saying like, well, they were saying ethnicity, but they actually just meant race anyway. And so there's a certain historical contingency and a politics that was that informed the definition of ethnicity or nation at that time that I think is productive to think about while thinking about the clear contradictions on the ground as well.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Other questions or comments, thoughts?
Well, I have a question. Okay. Okay, Jeremy, it's very nice to see you. And I was actually just reading Cedric Robinson's work last summer, so I'm very happy to hear that you brought it up today. I was particularly interested in what you're talking about, the early socialist critique of racism and racial capitalism and the way that it was done as the, what you call the externalization of the critique of racism, of racial capitalism, which offered a powerful critique, but on the other hand, it obscured the operation of this kind of, insidious logic of, exclusion, differentiation, normalization within, domestically. So what I hear from you, and this is what your talk is all about, I think, is that you're calling for a project sort of kind of to bring race back in to the study of actually existing socialism. You're kind of building on the project of the study of the work on racial capitalism by Cedric Robinson or Eric Williams, W.B. Du Bois, so on and so forth. So this is, I think, it's a beginning of a exciting project of sort of racializing the study. Racializing socialism. We may probably, it's to frame it that way. So to bring race back in to the study of socialism, think about it as this kind of, it's an internal logic. So if this is how, where you're moving to, then the clear, the immediate object, the object inquiry, of course, will be the national questions, the ethnopolitics, ethnicity, the frontier regions, so on and so forth. But I'm thinking whether it would be possible sort of to extend that critical project, if we take racism, as a broader kind of more general kind of logic, and I have Etienne Balibar's powerful arguments in mind when he argued that racism is actually a more general logic than something just based on ethno or biological, on ethno differences and or biological differences. But racism is actually a more general sociological logic on, involving normalization, differentiation, exclusion, naturalization, essentialization, so on and so forth. And he even, Eating Baliba even go as far as arguing that the modern notion of race actually did not, and initially did not have a national or ethnic origin, but it was actually a class or caste, signification, that it was only retroactively ethnicized or biologized so as that it could be incorporated into nationalist discourse. So if we think of racism or racial logic as a more broader phenomenon, then in what way can this project of internalizing, of racializing socialism be, can shed light on other aspects of socialist politics and society, culture, and the life, in addition to beyond the question of, the national question, the more in a more narrow, in a more limited fashion, the ethnicity frontier and so on and so forth. So maybe you can sort of, this is more kind of a interpretive speculative question.
Can I just ask for clarification, Cheng?
Yeah.
Sure. I guess thanks so much for the question, by the way. So I'm just wondering, are you pointing to the ways in which certain modes of social differentiation can then be understood through Balibar's discussion of race as a general logic, then, and then understand some forms of social differentiation that occur within the socialist period, as forms of racialization, then instead. But without,
I think you mentioned briefly in your talk, I think when you talk about the kind of the question of class genealogy, the biologization of social class identity, so on and so forth. You mentioned very briefly, I think.
So then, I think I guess one of the things I mentioned within that section is, I'm making allusions to your work too. Just thinking.
I didn't use that kind of. I didn't use that category in my work, but I think I should have.
No, the ways in which, but the ways in which, there's this critique amongst leftist intellectuals of understanding social formation through blood relations, within this earlier period, but then the ways in which certain the bloodline theory can definitely be understood that way, right? As in some ways maintaining some of the logics of this earlier racialist discourse that got associated with the so-called remnants of fascism at that time. And so I think that, that is one area that I was really interested in, but I was thinking mostly in terms of thinking about the national question. And so I think that I could definitely try to just explore a little further, the ways in which specifically this notion of blood relations gets reproduced within the socialist period. And your work is so helpful for me to think about that question with.
Yeah, but I didn't use that, I was not somehow thinking about that category, but now make me think that, there's actually more general processes and logics in operation here, that some of the preoccupations in class politics during the PRC is about purities and impurities, contaminations, so it's very much kind of close, related to the kind of racializing, I would try to avoid. I would try to say, it's a kind of racializing logic rather than the racist logic. I think that's. I think this is what Balibar's work. That's I recently reread that, and I think that's very interesting to make me rethink about my own work. And also, I think your work is this is kind of a breaking new path, pointing to a much broader kind of terrain of sort of racializing the study of socialism in a more general sense, I think.
Right. Yeah. I think it's interesting to think about like how racialization occurs like within these socialist contexts. I think like some scholars have of the Soviet Union have pointed to these certain ambiguities that occur within that context as well. The ways in which race and nation and ethnicity are like really one term like there, and then the ways in which race gets externalized in that context too. But at the same time, the ways in which these racializing processes of signification, they still exist in spite of this externalization of racial politics. And so just the ways in which they're symptomatic of like chauvinism as they were discussing at that time. So thank you for the question. Like this is really great. Thank you, Cheng.
Okay, I have another question, which is sort of more empirical, historical, if I may. So when we talk about, I mean, I wonder if it would be possible in your work, when we talk about the discourse on race in the early PRC in the especially in the 1950s, would it be possible to establish relationship between, or contextualize in relation to the debates in the field of genetics? In the early PRC, the dominance of variants of various I mean, it started first in the Soviet Union, of course. Of various forms of Lamarckian, I mean, genetics. I mean, Matuриnism, or Lysenkoism, and the attack on Mendelianism and Morganism in the 1950s, which culminated, during the Great Default, I guess. So, but that kind of discussion, I think, will be relevant in some way.
Definitely.
To the logic of the discussion of race, or but maybe that some connection can be made. I don't know.
Right. I think like that's why Zhou Jianren is like an interesting person to follow because he was so involved in these discussions of eugenics, and he was a major proponent of Lamarckianism in the 1920s at that time. So really pointing to these environmental factors, thinking that eugenics would lead to racial improvement in a non-coercive way through education and that kind of thing. And so there are ways in which, he reverses course after the Second World War, as I mentioned. And then there's his critique of eugenics and the ways in which different ideas about genetics can serve to perpetuate class-based interests. And so there is the insertion of like, this class-based politics within his work, like in the late 1940s. And so it would be interesting to think about that alongside, like, I guess the critiques of Pan Guandan and like others like within the early People's Republic of China, and like just follow that discourse and see how that works. And I think that's related to your earlier point as well, just thinking about how certain racial logics are still maintained within this larger discourse. So there's like really fascinating connections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. There's a question in the chat from Edwin Mickelson, and I was wondering, Edwin, if you wanted to unmute and ask it, or if, I don't know, Jeremy, if you are able to see that. Okay, sure.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. It's something that I've been interested in myself as well, working on Marxist proletarian literature across East Asia. This question of race, ethnicity lies very much at the heart of how to create solidarities among East Asian leftist writers. And so while my own work starts a bit from the 20s, I was just wondering with Sun Yat-sen, and was that idea of the kind of harmony among five races that Professor Fujitani also touched upon in the context of the Japanese Empire, that some also seems to overlap and on the one hand also be informed by the Soviet. So you see a lot of mixing and moving around across ideologies. So I wonder if So in that sense, early kind of coinage of this idea of the harmony among the 5 races, ethnicities of minzu, how that either conflates or connects with minzu in racial capitalism, especially at this time of so many debates on revolution and reform, and somehow certain domestic indigenous ideas of late Qing and the longer history of different groups being part of the Chinese empires, of how that in any way conflates, connects. I'm not sure if it's part of your work. Or if you know more about it.
Thanks for the question. Can I just ask for a clarification here? Just like, are you asking I guess, the Kuomintang's take on race and nation? Is that?
Well, I guess Kuomintang maybe comes out of that part, but maybe the kind of the 1900s, 1910s of how they already see that there's somehow 5 dominant groups, Hui, Tibet, and Han. So they recognize somehow a differentiation between groups, and how then when the more kind of ideas of racial capitalism get into the debates, if there's any kind of reproduction, conflation of the ideas that the previous had, or if they go into totally different directions somehow.
Right. So definitely this idea of like the Republic of 5 races, sometimes translated as the Republic of 5 nations, that is a departure, of course, from some of the founding principles of the 1911 revolutionaries, like that were calling for a Han Republic. And so the ways in which after the revolution, they were concerned about territorial fragmentation after that. And then they then seize on this idea of 5 races or nations that had actually been formulated by the constitutional monarchists in the Qing period to describe the new modern nation, and then in a way that they like ran with that. And so in the discussions in the Republican era, you have, of course, debates about whether these were separate groups or if they had amalgamated into a single nation, which was the official position by the 1930s of the Kuomintang. So the ways in which these groups, I think I had a slide here, were all from this like same bloodline and same racial stock, and all that really differentiated them was this the issues of religion and then also environment. And so I guess like one of the things I'm interested in thinking about when turning to like this right-wing discourse that also takes the context of racial capitalism as a point of departure is thinking about how some of these like programs that they instituted in response to the violence of racial capitalism, how that also relies on this conflation of race and nation. So like we can move into all of this virgin land, you know, and like, you know, the people there are just like part of us anyway. And so it's just like empty and unsettled. And so there's ways in which there's an adoption of certain terms of settler colonialism to understand that region in that period. And again, it was like directly inspired by the American frontier story, like this assumption that that value existed like out in this wilderness rather than being a product of like social labor, and the ways in which they could move into this area, and then they could also in a way commune with this region that was thought to be at that time this national homeland that was separate from these colonial treaty ports that they considered polluted at that time. And so there was the way in which they also maintain this notion of spiritual revival within the American frontier story as well. And so I'm like thinking, I guess, about that context through this literature that exists on like settler colonialism, and also this literature on racial capitalism as well. And so that's right now like how I'm, I guess, considering these right-wing articulations of race and nation.
Thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you. Mark?
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I had a question. I wanted to ask if you could speak a bit more about some of these contradictions about how race sort of on an international level and ethnicity or nationality domestically contradict each other or sit uncomfortably next to each other. I'm particularly interested in these kind of questions in the 1960s. So it's a little bit of a later period. I know you're focusing on the early PRC, but I just wanted to, you did mention briefly the Cultural Revolution at the end, and in the poster for the talk, the Cold War as well. So what I'm kind of thinking about is this kind of, we see sort of a movement in opposite directions at the same time almost, this kind of movement towards this internationalist solidarity during the Cold War that has this, you know, very much a kind of racial harmony, right? And I'm thinking of Robeson Taj Fraser's fairly recent book, The East is Black. And, you know, this movement for Afro, Asian solidarity. And at the same time, right, as this is being promoted internationally, domestically, we see a narrowing of the level of permissible difference within the PRC at that time, right? And I'm thinking, of course, of the border war with India, the rebellion in Tibet, and then into the Cultural Revolution as well, where the United Front departments, right, were one of the three revisionist bureaus, right, where this is where the problems were happening. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about either the contradictions or how these two conceptions sit uncomfortably, whether or not you think that where Cold War geopolitics factors in and how that might be connected to an earlier period as well. How this, you know, 1940s, 50s difference between race and nation, how that connects or not into the 1960s, or how it's used in specific ways for solidarity, but maybe also could be problematic in some ways domestically too, along the lines of what you and Professor Wu were talking about, racialization entering in new ways domestically as well. So if you could just, it's a lot of threads, but if you just want to pick up on some of those or any of those and elaborate, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And so I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is how both the question of race and also the national question, how they get subsumed into class-based politics, and then how they become narrowly understood simply in terms of class. And so just thinking about the ways in which as in the 1950s, as you have the United Front with non-Han peoples, how there's, I think, as Benno Wiener has discussed in his book, like the ways in which at first the CCP held off the class question within these areas and then promoted instead nationality struggle. And so the ways in which nationality struggle then gave way to a class struggle within those areas, and how this alliance that been forged with elites in those areas then gets cast off for organizing amongst amongst lower classes there. And so there's a way in which you have that, and then in the 1960s, I think, like particularly like after these high-profile visits, and especially by Robert Williams, the ways in which Chinese intellectuals then also follow Mao's declaration that the race question is a class question, and then also just narrowly focus on class exploitation. And then there's certain ways in which, I guess, like expropriation gets left out or like occluded as a question. And I think one interesting article that I read recently was about how indigenous groups from North America went to China, or was thinking alongside the Mao period because of land reform, and like thinking about the politics of land earlier. And so thinking about, I don't know if there's, I have to look up and see what discussions there are in that period. But there are, I guess, like ways in which you can explore like these kinds of conversations about expropriation that are going on within that period. And so there's ways in which I think like that, of course, contradicts with, the early PRC is like pointing to, I guess, these examples of exclusion, but also assimilationist policies like in other nations. And then at the same time, you have like assimilationist policies like in China, particularly in these like moments of high Maoism when you have these political campaigns targeting non-Han groups as backward and feudal. And so I think that there's certain intersections that I'm like thinking about when considering, I guess, the ways in which class figures into this distinction and the ways in which it subsumes these distinctions later. And then also thinking about how the question of expropriation, what the status of that is, like when that happens. And then thinking about the ways in which, this political violence, assimilationist policies can mirror some of what they're criticizing these other countries for.
Thank you.
Yes. So we have another question. Do you want to chime in?
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for that talk. I really enjoyed it and appreciated it. My background is in Tibetan studies, and there's a lot of focus on ethnicity and nationality and not a lot of focus on race. And I thought it was really helpful the way you explored the genealogy of kind of how that framing developed. So thank you so much. I had a particular question. I'm just thinking of an example in Tibetan history of Phuntsok Wangyal, who founds the Tibetan Communist Party. And he's a big fan of Stalin's definition of race because he sees it as offering sort of autonomy for Tibet. And he's highly placed in the Communist Party at first, but then later becomes a critic. And I'm wondering, when you have these articulations in journals such as Foreign Affairs that are arguing that racism is someplace else, did those kinds of publications, do they feature non-Han voices making those arguments? Does that factor in at all? Or is it mostly Han Chinese people speaking amongst themselves about these issues?
From the survey that I've conducted of World Affairs, I mean, it really seems like Han Chinese people speaking on behalf of the nation. And so I would be interested in like exploring any possible intersections. And so I really like called over like World Affairs, and then there's this other journal, minzu that ethnic unity or national unity that's seems to represent this distinction very clearly. And so I was, when I was doing this like primary source research, I was just looking for, ways in which this intersects. And like the only moments I saw that, the keyword race comes up like in like a journal like minzu is like when they deny the existence of race like within China and reiterate the need for attention to the national question instead. And then there are, I mean, I've seen a lot of translations of Soviet works that are critical of the US. So Soviet works that like discuss racial politics, like in the US. There's one particular, I can't remember right now, but yeah, I just, I can go back and look at and just like try to, I guess like try to identify any authors that could be speaking on behalf of these non-Han groups. And so can I ask you just if you could just say a little bit more. You said that the Tibetan intellectual was drawn to Stalin's discussion of race, or is it nation?
He was appreciating the definition of race around the idea of, common economy, common language, common culture. So that definition was appealing to him. But I think he framed it in terms of seeing sort of a more independence for Tibet, even vis-a-vis the central government, because he's in Eastern Tibet. And then he becomes so he likes Stalin's ideas, but then he doesn't like the way that they become implemented in later decades.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm going to look it up.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Well, if I can just make a very quick comment just to supplement this very interesting thread of discussion exchange. I think another area that would be fruitful to look at for this kind of complex relation of intersection between the ethnic activists and the communist revolution is Mongolia or Inner Mongolia. The figures like Ulan Fu, there were these Mongolian communists, who actively participated in the communist revolution that was largely a Han phenomena, and they allied very closely with the Chinese communists, and that generated all kind of very tricky, treacherous kind of developments later in the 40s, 50s, or even 60s.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
No, definitely.
So we are at time. There's a question from Andre, or just notes, I guess, too, from others in the chat that are there for you. I just left one now, so I'm like multitasking, which I'm not super good at. But yeah, this has been such a wonderful conversation. And thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing your work with us, and for everybody who's here and engaged in such a, just rich and generative conversation. I really thank you all. So stay tuned for information about the next talks that are coming up in this series. There's one at the end of February. I think it's end of February, but of course, I know this, but I don't know it right off the top of my head, but it's later this month, and then there will be one in the first week of April. Otherwise, thank you all again, and a round of applause for Professor Tai and for everybody here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my work.
Thank you all. Have a good day.